This world never sends a warning before it decides to grind you into dust. It does not knock politely on your door. It does not inquire if your psychological state is prepared for the impact. It simply strikes with absolute, unmitigated brutality. In that exact microsecond, the true fabric of a human being is violently stripped bare. The vast majority of the population will instinctively choose to shatter. They weep. They seek external validation. They aggressively cling to any fleeting source of comfort to escape the freezing reality of their situation. But not you. If you are breathing in this specific space right now, it means you have permanently rejected that pathetic, submissive version of existence. You have chosen the path of the predator, the absolute apex of psychological autonomy. Niccolò Machiavelli never bothered to write his strategic doctrines for those cradled in luxury and artificial safety. He wrote exclusively for the discarded, the betrayed, and the systematically broken, because he decoded a dark, immutable law of the cosmos. The ultimate game of power only begins when you have been stripped of everything you once relied upon. When your entire reality collapses into chaos, it is a silent, cosmic audit. Your financial leverage vanishes. The people who swore eternal loyalty vanish, and your future transforms into a pitch-black abyss. It is precisely within this storm that you will meet your rawest, unedited self. If your mind is structurally weak, you will slowly rot in the toxic swamp of self-pity. But if your cognitive core is cold, hyper-alert, and entirely detached, you will evolve. Pain has never been your enemy. It is the most efficient filter ever created to separate the fragile from the forged. This world responds exclusively to the weight of your psychological dominance. When they intentionally leave you stranded in the dark, do not make the amateur mistake of screaming for rescue. Sit in the absolute silence. Dissect every thought. Isolate every emotional vulnerability. Locate the exact coordinates where your weakness resides, and systematically starve it to death. Do not reach outward for a savior. Reach inward for your weapon. Once you construct a mind that refuses to bend under the crushing weight of existential pressure, you become completely uncontrollable. You are not here to be liked by the herd. You are here to become dangerous to anything that ever dared to attempt to break you. Visualize a freezing, pitch-black dungeon in 16th century Florence, where a man has just survived the agonizing torture of the strappado, his shoulder joints stretched to the absolute limit of dislocation. That man was Niccolò Machiavelli. Stripped of his political status, his wealth, and his reputation, he did not waste a single second composing pathetic letters begging for mercy. Instead, inside his isolated, impoverished rural estate, he put on his finest court robes every single night, lit a single candle, and entered a silent dialogue with the greatest minds of ancient history to author The Prince, the ultimate textbook on raw power. Machiavelli understood that when the world strips away every external weapon, your only sovereign defense is the internal architecture of your mind. His legacy is not a cliché story of overcoming hardship. It is the genesis of a cold, calculated law of mental power. To survive this intensive journey, and to maintain your focus throughout this 30-minute psychological transmission, you must completely incinerate the victim mindset. We will now dissect 5 of the darkest psychological laws ever formulated, designed to rewire your neural pathways, weaponize your emotional scars, and elevate you from the position of the hunted to the absolute throne of self-mastery. Rule 1. The assimilation of pain. Weak minds seek comfort, strong minds command control. What is the immediate, instinctive reaction of an untrained brain encountering psychological trauma? It is an aggressive, desperate search for immediate sedation. When normal human beings are betrayed or crushed by failure, they immediately run toward short-term dopamine hits, toxic distractions, or superficial social circles just to hear empty words of validation. They require an immediate emotional anesthetic to temporarily blind themselves to the reality of their own weakness. But in the architecture of power psychology, comfort is the exact location where your potential is buried alive. Pacifying the masses by engineering cheap comfort and endless entertainment has been the foundational strategy of rulers since the dawn of civilization. A mind chronically addicted to ease will never possess the raw energy required to seize supreme power. If your objective is to become completely untouchable, you must radically restructure how your central nervous system processes adversity. Machiavelli asserted that control is the absolute highest manifestation of power. And it never begins with the manipulation of external subjects, it begins with the total domination of your internal impulses. You have been systematically trained by modern society to numb your edge. Endless scrolling, compulsive consumption, and projecting blame outward. All of this is engineered to prevent you from facing the brutal civil war occurring within your own consciousness. The individual who masters his own reactions owns the chessboard, while the desperate herd runs toward immediate pleasure to escape their internal void. You must force yourself to sit directly within that discomfort. When they panic, you calculate. When they seek emotional reassurance, you employ strategic skepticism. This is not heartlessness. It is absolute psychological dominance over the only variable that genuinely matters: your own mind. The mediocre individuals around you will begin to label you as cold, detached, or clinical when they notice you no longer experience involuntary emotional reactions to external chaos. Let them talk. They are merely terrified because they realize their historical methods of manipulation no longer function on you. Your absolute silence creates an intense psychological vacuum. Your indifference becomes a lethal strike against their vanity. You do not require their understanding or approval. You require your mind to obey your absolute will without hesitation. This path demands that you look directly into your darkest cognitive corners and refuse to flinch. Rule 2. Sever the emotional conduit. Weaponize the psychological edge. You were never truly weak because life dealt you a brutal hand. You became weak the exact second you allowed your raw emotions to hijack your rational judgment and dictate your perception of reality. The moment you hand over your cognitive sovereignty to anger, jealousy, or panic, you voluntarily present yourself as prey for advanced psychological predators. Understand this fundamental law. Pain is an objective biological data point, but the interpretation of that data is entirely your sovereign choice. In high-level behavioral psychology, the individual who controls the meaning of an event controls the entire outcome. Life can break your physical frame, but if it successfully fractures your mental focus, it simply proves you were never structurally prepared for the game of power. The truth that most individuals desperately flee from is their delusional belief that explosive, uninhibited emotional reactions make them authentic. It does not. It makes you profoundly predictable. The predatory forces of this world are constantly studying your behavioral patterns, logging your triggers, and charting your vulnerabilities. If your reactions are automated based on evolutionary instinct, you are already bought and paid for. They know exactly which words will trigger your rage, which actions will ignite your insecurity, and which scenarios will activate your desperate need for validation. Every time you react precisely as they anticipated, you hand them the remote control to your life. Therefore, the only logical move is total emotional discipline. This does not imply transforming yourself into an inanimate object. It implies becoming an elite, highly selective cognitive filter. You perceive the heat of the fire, but your position does not shift by a single millimeter unless that movement is entirely calculated. You may bleed internally, but only behind heavily locked doors where no external eye can harvest your data. You speak significantly less, but every single syllable that leaves your mouth lands with the weight of a definitive verdict. Do not waste a single watt of intellectual energy arguing with individuals who are deeply invested in misunderstanding you. Why? Because your attention is a sacred asset, and absolutely no one deserves access to your mind until they have paid the price to be there. Machiavelli famously noted that it is infinitely safer to be feared than loved. In psychological warfare, love is a volatile variable tied to softness, whereas awe and calculated fear keep human beings frozen in a state of absolute caution. They will measure their words, second-guess their strategies, and respect your boundaries simply because they cannot map your limits. That is the psychological edge you are forging, a quiet, lethal presence that requires no noise to command absolute compliance. Rule 3. Smash the victim narrative. Architect the strategic self. The vast majority of human beings live a psychologically paralyzed life because they passively accept the script that tragedy wrote for them. They proudly wear their traumas like a collection of medals, parading their suffering across the social landscape in the desperate hope that the world will stop and compensate them. But Machiavellian power is never distributed through the charity of pity. It is systematically seized through relentless mental warfare. If your ambition is to become structurally untouchable, your immediate objective must be to shred the victim identity to absolute pieces. Erase the delusional narrative that you were uniquely wronged, that someone owes you a profound apology, or that life owes you a fair opportunity. This universe owes you absolutely nothing, but it will gladly surrender its most coveted positions of power to you if you prove you are ruthless enough to extract it from the jaws of fate. Your past trauma is not a personality trait. Your historic suffering is not your sovereign identity. Stop romanticizing your wounds by calling them your truth. It was merely an operational phase, a direct hit, an aggressive stress test designed to measure the structural load your mind could sustain. Now, incinerate it. You are under no obligation to explain to the world how broken you used to be. You are here to force the world to witness the terrifyingly sharp weapon you became because of it. Ghostly figures from your past will intentionally attempt to reference your obsolete, damaged version to maintain their cognitive leverage over you. Let them try. Just ensure that when they look into your eyes today, they realize the soft creature they are attempting to manipulate has been completely eradicated from existence. Machiavelli understood an essential reality. Public perception is infinitely more potent than objective reality. Therefore, when you choose to speak, let your words cut with surgical finality. When you navigate a room, carry your silence like a concealed weapon. When they doubt your capability, do not waste your breath offering an explanation. Use raw, undeniable execution to erase their skepticism. There will be agonizing nights when your old programming rebels, when ancient memories return to assault your focus, and you question every calculated decision you have made. In those isolated moments of internal warfare, you have exactly two choices: collapse back into the predictable comfort of weakness, or continue constructing your psychological empire. The brain does not respect motivational quotes. It respects the brutal reality of cold discipline under extreme pressure. Rule 4. Absolute detachment. Emotional independence and cold dominance. Indiscriminate emotional attachment is the silent executioner of raw mental power. In its initial stages, it disguises itself beautifully as loyalty, love, hope, or deep human connection. But beneath that warm surface, attachment is quietly converting your psychological strength into heavy iron chains. You begin to wait anxiously for a communication. You chase toxic dynamics, and you aggressively compromise your core standards just to maintain access to people, places, and paradigms that were never structurally meant to remain in your life. That is the primary fracture in your mental armor. Investing your sacred energy into assets that do not care about your survival. Machiavelli never secured his structural influence by clinging desperately to alliances. His foundational methodology was to observe, calculate value, assign a strategic expiration date, and detach without a single shred of hesitation the moment the operational utility concluded. To train a mind capable of remaining entirely unaffected by the knives of betrayal, you must etch this principle into your core. Never attach your internal peace to any variable outside your direct control. Not a human being, not a specific external outcome, and definitely not the idealized image of who you think you are supposed to be. The exact millisecond an external factor dictates your internal state, that factor has officially enslaved you. And an enslaved mind is a liabilities machine. The most dangerous individual on this planet is one who is entirely emotionally independent. You must achieve absolute mastery in appearing completely tranquil while your immediate environment is descending into an chaotic storm. When the people around you realize you no longer panic, no longer beg for access, and no longer react to their bait, they enter a state of deep psychological disorientation. Your silence becomes an intense weight in the room. Your absence becomes deafeningly loud, and your clinical detachment becomes your absolute dominance. While the rest of the world is frantically searching for an emotional anchor, you are anchored entirely within your own sovereign framework. This detachment is not a passive retreat from reality. It is the ultimate conservation of power. Every time you refuse to explain yourself, you sharpen your long-term focus. Every time you choose not to react, you reclaim your internal energy. And every single time you calmly walk away from a low-value dynamic, you broadcast a clear message. You cannot be bought, you cannot be owned, and you are only to be observed from a highly secure distance. Rule 5. Construct the strategic isolation fortress, the Forge of Kings. This modern social engineering apparatus constantly injects the narrative into your brain that being alone is a definitive failure. That prolonged isolation is a clear diagnostic sign of psychological instability. But that is a lie formulated by individuals who are utterly incapable of surviving the deafening roar of their own internal emptiness. Weak minds possess a desperate, chronic requirement for external noise, superficial crowds, and meaningless validation to distract their focus from the brutal civil war raging within their own consciousness. But you must operate on an entirely different frequency. To achieve supreme self-mastery, you must willingly enter a developmental phase that 99% of the population will actively flee. The phase of deliberate, calculated isolation. This is not the loneliness of the rejected. It is the tactical solitude of the sovereign ruler. When the external world is forcibly muted, your internal algorithms become hyper-visible. Every primitive fear, every deep-seated insecurity, and every historical regret will violently rush to the surface of your awareness. Do not flinch. This is not an attack on your sanity. It is a comprehensive psychological audit. This is the exact dark space where Machiavelli engineered his immortality. He observed the political chessboard from the shadows, sharpening his strategic insights, while the elite class forlessly wasted their leverage under the bright lights of temporary courts. Solitude grants you the ultimate privilege, a perspective entirely uncorrupted by social illusions. You see with absolute, chilling clarity exactly who broke you, the precise mechanisms they use to exploit your softness, and the specific obsolete components of your psychology that must be immediately burned to the ground so you can rise. The average person will aggressively evade this process by immediately activating audio distractions, scrolling mindlessly, or initiating a low-value conversation. But you will choose to sit directly within that silence and completely dominate it. You will listen to your ego scream for its old validation hits, and you will systematically execute those desires one by one. This is not a soft, spiritual healing retreat. This is a brutal, cold architectural overhaul of your entire cognitive system. It is clinical, it is agonizing, but it is real. Within this isolation fortress, you delete the code of the servant and upload the operating system of the grand strategist. You no longer hunt for cheap dopamine. You hunt for flawless execution. You no longer ask, "Why did this happen to me?" You ask, "How do I exploit this data point for maximum leverage?" Your silence becomes your training ground. Your isolation becomes your ultimate weapon. When you no longer require a single soul to validate your existence, you are officially free from their control. Rule 6. Translate pain into surgical precision. The mind of the tactician. Pain is the ultimate, unedited intelligence test that reality administers to your character. Not academic institutions, not theoretical textbooks, but raw, unfiltered pain, the specific kind that violently shatters your daily routine, completely humiliates your ego, and slices through your comforting social illusions. In the midst of that structural chaos, the weak human being begs for immediate comfort. But the natural-born ruler goes completely silent. They aggressively shut down their emotional processing units and immediately activate their strategic calculation systems. They view pain not as a tragedy, but as a dense packet of raw, highly classified intelligence data. It is a severe warning shot from the cosmos stating, "Adapt your operational architecture immediately, or accept total liquidation from the game." If you are still reacting to betrayal or loss with emotional outbursts, you are illiterate to the language of power. Pain is pure objective data. It marks the exact coordinates where your defensive perimeter was compromised. It reveals precisely who you overvalued, which forces you dangerously underestimated, and which specific habits have been scattering your sovereign energy. This is the moment you must learn to handle pain like a clinical scalpel. Sit with it in isolation, dissect it, and demand an answer to the question, why did this specific strike possess the leverage to penetrate my core? The root cause invariably traces back to a single variable. You allowed your hypervigilance to fall asleep inside the illusion of safety. Machiavelli continuously warned that peace should never lull a leader into a state of cognitive softness. This world is not a safe, nurturing playground. It is a cutthroat arena of shifting human motivations, hidden traps, and severe consequences. The moment you approach your existence with the mindset of a military general on a battlefield, pain completely loses its ability to traumatize you. It transforms into operational feedback. Heartbreak becomes elite data for filtering human access. Business failure becomes precise mapping coordinates for a structural pivot. The betrayal of an associate becomes a definitive checklist of security vulnerabilities that must be permanently sealed shut. While the herd collapses into emotional paralysis, you begin manufacturing calculated responses. A genuine strategic response is a cold, timed, highly deliberate product of logic that is raw power. The average population is playing a frantic game of checkers with their life moving too fast, producing too much noise, and dripping with desperation. You play grandmaster chess. You permanently stop asking why me, and aggressively ask, where does this pain position my leverage on the board 5 years from today? Every single time reality cuts you, do not waste a drop of your blood. Analyze the edge of the blade. Rule 7. Achieve absolute emotional immunity. Liquidate the manipulation matrix. Let us establish a hard, unfiltered truth. This world does not destroy your leverage using physical weapons. It systematically liquidates your power using manufactured expectations, intense social pressure, and deeply engineered emotional bait. You are continuously socialized to maintain an polite demeanor when your boundaries are being crossed, to grant unearned forgiveness to entities that intentionally exploited your kindness, and to offer long explanations when you choose to permanently vanish from a dynamic. Every single time you comply with these artificial moral codes, you are actively surrendering a piece of your sovereign autonomy to the control matrix. That is exactly how manipulation functions, not through brute force, but through the weaponization of guilt. But you are officially retiring from that game today. You will never again bleed for entities that are quietly sharpening their knives behind your back. This is the exact moment you must activate your absolute emotional immunity. It is critical to understand the profound structural difference between numbness and immunity. Numbness is an act of cowardice, a desperate attempt to avoid feeling the strike because you fear its damage. Immunity is the advanced ability to fully absorb the impact of the blow while your internal architecture remains completely unbothered. That is the apex level of power you are now deploying. You hear the insult. You witness the sudden betrayal. You observe the malicious smear campaigns. But absolutely none of that toxic data can penetrate your internal fortress. Why? Because you have heavily reinforced your psychological walls with raw objective truth, and no external lie holds the leverage to destabilize your crown. Individuals with weak psychological frames scatter their energy like water. A single negative comment from an anonymous account on the internet can cause them to spiral into a week of depression. A single unreturned message can induce them to completely abandon their self-respect to beg for attention. A minor professional setback causes them to immediately adopt the pathetic identity of a tragic victim of fate. But a Machiavellian ruler refuses to permit external chaos to dictate their internal weather. You must execute a cold, ruthless audit of your energy matrix. Every human connection, every daily conversation, and every environment you inhabit must be weighed against this clinical question. Is this asset actively reinforcing my mental power, or is it systematically diluting it? The exact moment you detect the subtle frequencies of manipulation or emotional inconsistency, you must sever the connection strategically, silently, and permanently. This is not an act of emotional revenge. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Rule 8. Weaponize your presence. Assume supreme space in silence. The individuals who wield genuine, terrifying leverage on this planet do not speak frequently. They do not waste an ounce of energy explaining their worth to entities operating on a lower cognitive frequency, and they completely refuse to engage in loud, emotional public debates. They navigate reality wrapped in absolute silence. Yet the specific atmospheric pressure surrounding their presence communicates a message infinitely more potent than any speech ever delivered. This is not temporary arrogance. It is elite energetic calibration. They understand the exact nature of the battlefield they are walking across. They know thousands of calculating eyes are watching for a single crack in their armor, and they understand a supreme law. The less data you broadcast, the more control you maintain over the room. You have no requirement to raise your voice to command attention. You merely need to carry a psychological weight that forces the entities around you to adjust their behavior the moment you cross the threshold. This is the core tactical essence of Machiavelli's doctrine. A leader must always maintain an unreadable, deeply commanding aura, because in the grand game of power, the enemy's perception of your limits dictates their strategy against you. Right now, you are systematically training your mind to embody that exact state. An unreadable presence, completely tranquil like a frozen ocean, yet carrying the crushing pressure of a tectonic plate. Your absolute lack of emotional reaction functions as a terrifying psychological mirror. When a manipulative individual confronts someone who is completely silent and emotionally unavailable, their own mind begins to violently destabilize. They enter a state of deep anxiety, projecting their own guilt, hidden motivations, and paranoia onto your silence. They will instinctively begin talking too much to fill the uncomfortable void. And through that frantic overexpression, they will completely expose their entire hand, while you have not even lifted a single finger. Observe the immediate shift in atmospheric density when an individual with genuine self-mastery enters a space. Meaningless gossip instantly evaporates, loose postures are corrected, and the entire room adopts a serious tone. That is not mystical magic. It is the gravity of presence. And this specific gravity cannot be purchased with currency. It is accumulated through months of total isolation in the mental gym, from mastering your impulses when absolutely no one is watching. Weak individuals possess a chronic, desperate need to overcompensate. They talk too much, brag too loud, and offer endless explanations, all of which are pathetic camouflage for a deep-seated internal panic. You, however, are transforming into a rare species, an entity capable of standing perfectly still and smiling coldly in the center of a roaring storm without offering a single word of defense. Rule 9. The unbreakable mind, the sovereign psychological empire. You have navigated the freezing winters of absolute betrayal. You have endured the deafening silence of prolonged isolation. And you have sat entirely alone in the pitch black with predatory thoughts that came remarkably close to consuming your soul alive. Yet, look at the reality of this moment. You are still here. You did not break, you did not fade away, and you did not compromise. In fact, you emerged from that fire significantly more powerful, profoundly quieter, and intensely colder than you have ever been in your entire existence. This transformation did not occur because reality became gentler. It occurred because you finally decoded the foundational law of human experience. This world never rewards softness. It bows exclusively to a mind that systematically refuses to surrender even when every external pillar has been utterly demolished. This is the exact microsecond you permanently alter your psychological architecture. You are no longer a mere survivor of hardship. You are no longer a broken casualty looking for sympathy. You are a highly calibrated strategic weapon. You are a dense, heavy presence, a mind that refuses to blink when tested by fate, because your focus has already been forged in the absolute dark of internal warfare. Machiavelli delivered a chilling, immutable verdict to history. Men must either be caressed or crushed, because power contains absolutely no room for half measures. It completely ignores those who operate on volatile emotional impulses, and it holds deep contempt for those who rely on empty hope. It surrenders its keys exclusively to those who train their minds like an assassin polishes a blade. Hyper-sharp, ice-cold, and perpetually poised to execute the definitive outcome. This final developmental stage is the exact location where 99% of the herd will voluntarily quit the path. They will begin to intensely miss their old, predictable comfort zones, the comforting noise of superficial validation, and the safety of mediocre social circles. But you are no longer wired for the herd. You possess zero desire to nostalgically look back at your past, because you have personally set fire to the bridge connecting you to your old self. You have paid a catastrophic price to learn what softness earns you. You get overlooked, you get exploited, and you get forgotten. You have seen the definitive end of over-explaining. It simply teaches people to ignore your boundaries. You have analyzed the outcome of emotional reactivity. You are handing your weapons directly to your enemy. You have permanently outgrown those infantile games. From this day forward, you do not look backward to weep. You only look forward to architect your absolute dominance. The end. This world never sends a warning before it decides to grind you into dust. It does not knock politely on your door. It does not inquire if your psychological state is prepared for the impact. It simply strikes with absolute, unmitigated brutality. But now, when that darkness inevitably returns to test your resolve, it will discover an empty room where your fragile self used to reside. You are no longer the soft creature who stands there weeping, begging for shelter from artificial alliances. You have fully integrated the cold, calculated laws of Machiavelli. You have successfully converted your pain into pure data, your isolation into a sovereign throne, and your absolute silence into the most lethal weapon on the board. When reality attempts to fracture your frame once more, you will simply smile coldly, look directly into the eyes of adversity, and force it to realize who truly commands the matrix of this room. Because once your mind has entered the deep freeze of absolute self-mastery, you are permanently untouchable. You are the supreme ruler of your own internal empire,